He told me to keep the window open. The night Daniel Rowe disappeared, the silence of Lake Waverly felt like a physical weight, pressing against the cedar walls of Claire's cabin. She did the only thing he had asked of her. She unlatched the heavy brass lock, slid the glass up, and let the freezing Vermont air pour into her bedroom. "Keep the window open," he had whispered, his breath hitching as if he were looking over his shoulder. "No matter how cold it gets, even if the town starts talking, even if I don't come back, promise me, Claire." That was 6 months ago. Since then, Claire had become a ghost in her own life. The locals at the general store called her the widow of the lake, though she'd never been a wife. They watched her with pitying eyes as she bought her coffee and firewood, whispering about the woman who slept with her windows open in the dead of winter. They didn't know that the wind was the only thing that kept her sane. It carried the scent of wet pine, ancient silt, and a metallic tang that felt like a dying memory. The stranger in the storm. A year ago, Daniel had arrived like a fracture in the world. It was a night where the sky seemed to collapse, thunder echoing across the water like artillery fire. When the power flickered and died, Claire had lit a single candle. In the amber glow, she saw him a silhouette through the glass door, drenched, his chest heaving. "The road washed out," he'd said, his voice a low, melodic rasp. "I was told Lake Road leads to the highway. I think it led me into a trap instead." He called himself a novelist. He had the hands of a writer, long, restless fingers, but the eyes of a soldier. They were eyes that never stayed on one thing for too long, always scanning the corners of the room, the locks on the doors, the darkness beyond the trees. For months, they lived in a fragile peace. He fixed the rotting floorboards. She taught him the names of the constellations that mirrored themselves in the lake. But Daniel was a man made of shadows. He'd wake up screaming in a language Claire didn't recognize, and he carried a jagged, puckered scar on his shoulder that looked less like a surgery and more like a brand. The night before he vanished, the peace shattered. "I'm not who you think I am," he told her, standing by that very window. The moonlight turned his skin to marble. "There are people who trade in secrets, Claire, and I took something from them that they can't afford to lose. Tell me who they are," she pleaded. "We can go to the police. Sheriff Miller is a good man." Daniel had laughed then, a dry, hollow sound. "In a town this small, good is just a mask for quiet. If I disappear, don't look for me. Don't ask questions. Just keep that window open. If it's closed, I'll know they've got you, too." The next morning, the cabin was hollow. His typewriter was gone. His car was gone. Even the scent of his cologne had been scrubbed from the sheets, replaced by the damp, chilling draft of the open window. The signal in the fog. October arrived with a frost that turned the lake into a sheet of black glass. Claire sat wrapped in a wool blanket, staring at the opposite shore. There, nestled in the thicket of hemlocks, sat the Rangers Station, a structure abandoned since the 70s, rotting into the earth. Suddenly, a light pierced the fog. Flash, flash, flash. Long. Flash, flash, short. Flash. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. It was their code, the one he'd used to signal her from the dock when he'd been out fishing late. She didn't grab her phone. She knew instinctively that the airwaves weren't safe. She grabbed a heavy mag light, threw on her parka, and sprinted into the woods. The trail was a labyrinth of slick leaves and grasping roots. The forest felt alive, the trees leaning in as if to eavesdrop on her frantic breathing. When she reached the ranger station, the smell hit her first. Not rot, but ozone and gun oil. The door creaked open. Inside, the beam of her flashlight cut through a haze of dust. On the central desk, pinned down by a jagged piece of slate, was a page torn from a notebook. The handwriting was jagged, hurried. They found the ledger. "Miller isn't a cop. He's a cleaner. Get out. Don't go home. You shouldn't have come here, Claire." The voice came from the darkness behind her. She spun around, the flashlight beam landing on the tan uniform of Sheriff Miller. He looked exactly as he always did, dependable, the picture of small-town law. But as he stepped into the light, she saw the coldness in his eyes. He wasn't looking at her with concern. He was looking at her like an unfinished chore. "Sheriff," she gasped, tucking the note into her sleeve. "I saw a light. I thought someone was hurt." "Someone is," Miller said, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. Daniel Rowe, whatever he called himself this week, was a very thief. He took something from some very powerful people in Montpelier, something that involves the deed to this entire shoreline. And he's been using you as a shield for 6 months. "He's a writer," she lied, her voice trembling. "He's a ghost," Miller countered, stepping closer. "And ghosts have a habit of dragging the living down with them. Now, where is the ledger, Claire? He told you to keep that window open so he could slip back in and fetch it, didn't he?" The shadow in the frame. Claire backed away, her heels hitting the edge of an open window at the back of the station. The wind howled through it, whipping her hair across her face. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered. Miller drew his gun. The click of the safety was the loudest sound she had ever heard. "I think you do. I think you've been waiting for a dead man while the answer was under your nose the whole time." He raised the barrel, aiming for her chest. Suddenly, a blur of movement erupted from the rafters above. A figure dropped like a stone, slamming into Miller with the force of a landslide. A gunshot rang out, shattering a window pane, the sound echoing across the lake like a crack in the world. The two men tumbled across the floor in a mess of limbs and snarls. Claire watched in horror as the sheriff's heavy frame was pinned by a man who looked like a hollowed-out version of the Daniel she knew. He was gaunt, his face mapped with new scars, his eyes burning with a desperate, feral light. Daniel didn't use a gun. He used a heavy glass paperweight from the desk, bringing it down once, twice, until Miller went limp. Silence reclaimed the cabin, save for Daniel's ragged gasps. "Daniel," Claire breathed, her voice cracking. He stood up slowly, wiping blood from his forehead. He didn't run to her. He stayed in the shadows, looking at her with a profound, aching sadness. "I told you not to look," he said. His voice was different, harder, stripped of the warmth it once held. "You left me," she screamed, the months of grief finally boiling over. "You left me in that cabin with the wind and the ghosts. I stayed in the woods," he whispered, gesturing to the dark tree line. "I watched your window every night. As long as it was open, I knew you were alone. I knew they hadn't started questioning you yet. If you had closed it, I would have burned this whole town down to get you out." "Is it over?" she asked, looking at the sheriff's body. "For him, yes. For us?" Daniel looked toward the lake, where the first hints of dawn were graying the sky. "The ledger I took, it names people far higher than a local sheriff. I have to finish this, Claire. I came back to tell you that you can finally close the window." "No," she said, reaching out, her fingers just grazing his tattered sleeve. "I won't." He leaned in, kissing her forehead, a cold, fleeting touch that tasted of salt and ending. "Close it, Claire. Move to the city. Forget the man who came in from the rain." By the time the state police arrived at dawn, the ranger station was empty. Sheriff Miller was gone, his cruiser found abandoned at the bottom of the lake a week later, but no body was ever recovered. Claire stayed in the cedar cabin. She didn't move to the city. She didn't forget. She eventually stopped buying 2 cups of coffee. She eventually stopped looking for his silhouette on the opposite shore. But every night, before she climbed into bed, she reached for the brass handle of her bedroom window. She slid it up, letting the Vermont winter bite at her skin. People in town still call her the woman who waits. They think she's a tragic figure, a victim of a broken heart. They don't realize that she isn't waiting for a man to return. She's listening. Because sometimes, when the wind is just right, she hears a faint whistle from the trees, the same 3-2-1 signal. And she knows that out there, in the darkness between the trees and the water, someone is still watching over the open window.